thought getting on TV would be the highlight of my year. Instead, it became the day I discovered my entire life was built on a lie that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Sarah, and at 28, I thought I had life figured out. I was living in Portland with my boyfriend Marcus, working as a marketing coordinator for a local tech startup, and genuinely happy with my small but close-knit world. My family wasn't huge, but we were tight. There was my mom, Janet, my dad, Robert, who'd raised me since I was 2, and my older brother, Kyle. We did Sunday dinners every week, went camping together every summer, and had this unshakable bond that I genuinely believed nothing could break. The whole TV show thing started as a joke, really. I was scrolling through Facebook one evening in March when I saw this casting call for a new reality show called Family Secrets Revealed. They were looking for families willing to take DNA tests on camera to explore their genealogy and potentially uncover interesting family history. The description made it sound fun and educational, like those Ancestry commercials where people discover they repart Viking or have royal blood somewhere in their lineage. Look at this. I called out to Marcus, who was cooking dinner in our tiny kitchen. They want families to do DNA tests on TV. Wouldn't it be cool if we found out I'm related to someone famous? Marcus laughed and shook his head. You and your reality TV obsession? Next, you'll want to be on The Bachelor. But the idea stuck with me. My family had always been curious about our roots. Dad's side was supposedly Scottish, and Mom claimed we had some Native American heritage, though she could never prove it. We had these family stories passed down through generations, but nothing concrete. The show was offering $5,000 to participating families, which honestly wasn't the main draw, but it didn't hurt either. I brought it up at Sunday dinner the next week. We were sitting around Mom's dining room table, the same one where I'd done homework as a kid, eating her famous pot roast and mashed potatoes. Kyle was there with his wife Jessica and their 2-year-old daughter Emma, who is currently throwing peas at the wall with impressive accuracy. So there's this TV show I started, and immediately Kyle groaned. Please tell me you're not trying to get on some dating show, he said, wiping Emma's face with a napkin. No, it's about family history. They want families to take DNA tests and explore their genealogy on camera. Could find out where we really come from, maybe discover some cool ancestors. Mom's face lit up immediately. She'd always been the family historian, the one who kept photo albums and tried to trace our family tree on those genealogy websites. That sounds fascinating. We could finally prove the Native American connection. Dad was more skeptical. He was always the practical one, the guy who read the fine print and worried about things like privacy. What do they do with the DNA information afterward? I don't like the idea of some TV network having our genetic data. Dad, it's just for genealogy, I insisted. They probably use the same labs as those ancestry companies. Think about it. We could discover something amazing about our family history. The conversation went back and forth for a while. Kyle was interested but cautious. Jessica thought it sounded fun. Dad kept asking questions about privacy and contracts. But by the end of dinner, we'd basically agreed to apply. The worst they could do was say no, right? The application process was surprisingly involved. We had to fill out detailed questionnaires about our family history, submit photos from different generations, and record video interviews about what we hoped to discover. The production team was particularly interested in the fact that we were a blended family. Dad had married Mom when I was just 2. After my biological father had walked out, they seemed to think there might be interesting stories there. It could add an emotional element to your episode, the casting director, a bubbly woman named Christina, told us during our video call. Stories about chosen family versus biological family really resonate with audiences. I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable with how excited she seemed about what was essentially my dad stepping up, when another man couldn't be bothered. But the whole family was invested in the idea by then, and we were all curious about what we might learn. We were selected for the show, and filming would begin in 3 weeks. They wanted us to come to their Los Angeles studio for a long weekend of interviews and the actual DNA test reveal. The excitement in our family was infectious. Mom immediately started planning what she would wear. Kyle joked about becoming famous. And Dad even seemed to warm up to the idea once they assured us we would have control over how much personal information was shared. This is going to be so cool, I told Marcus the night before we left for LA. What if we find out we're descendants of some historical figure or connected to royalty? He kissed my forehead and smiled. Just promise me you won't, and let it go to your head if you find out you. Related to Napoleon or something? I fell asleep that night, practically vibrating with excitement. I had these visions of discovering we were connected to some fascinating historical lineage, maybe finding distant relatives in other countries, learning about cultural traditions we never knew belonged to us. I imagined how proud I'd be watching our episode, seeing our family's story unfold on national television. If I had known what was actually waiting for me in those DNA results, I would have torn up that application and never looked back. But sometimes ignorance really is bliss. I was about to learn just how devastating the truth can be when you're not prepared for it. The red flags started small, the way they always do. Looking back now, I can see them clearly. But at the time, they felt like minor inconveniences rather than warnings that my world was about to implode. The first weird thing happened during our initial interviews at the studio. The production team had set up this beautiful set that looked like a cozy family room with warm lighting and comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. They interviewed each of us separately first, asking about our family dynamics, our expectations for the DNA results, and our relationships with each other. When it was my turn, the interviewer, a middle-aged man named David, with kind eyes and a gentle voice, asked me to talk about my relationship with my dad. It should have been easy. The man who'd raised me, taught me to drive, walked me to school every day until I was old enough to be embarrassed by it. But something in David's tone made me pause. "Tell me about your earliest memories with Robert," he said, and there was this careful way he phrased it that felt loaded somehow. "He's the only father I've ever known," I said. "My biological father left when I was really young, but Dad has been there for everything. He's the one who came to my school plays, taught me to ride a bike, helped me with math homework, even though he hated math." David nodded and scribbled something in his notes. "And you've never had any contact with your biological father?" "Never," Mom said. "He just disappeared one day. Honestly, I've never even been curious about him. Why would I be? I have a dad." But David kept pushing, asking questions about whether I'd ever wondered about my biological father's family, his medical history, his background. It felt invasive and unnecessary. We were here to learn about our ancestry, not dig into painful family history that had been resolved decades ago. The weirdness continued during the family interviews. Kept asking questions that seemed designed to highlight the fact that Dad wasn't my biological father. They wanted to know if there were any family traits I didn't share, any moments where I felt different from Kyle or my parents. It felt like they were trying to create drama where none existed. Sometimes reality show producers will try to manufacture conflict. Marcus warned me that evening when I called him from the hotel. Don't let them manipulate you into saying anything that isn't true. But it wasn't just the interview questions. There were other small things that started to feel strange. During breaks, I noticed some of the production assistants whispering and looking at me with these pitying expressions. When I walked by the craft services table, conversations would suddenly stop. It felt like everyone knew something I didn't, and the paranoia was starting to eat at me. The most unsettling moment came on the second day, when they were preparing us for the DNA results reveal. A producer named Angela pulled me aside and asked if I had anyone I could call for emotional support after filming Wrapped. "Emotional support for what?" I asked. "We're just finding out about our ancestry." Angela gave me this careful, practiced smile. "Sometimes families discover unexpected information through DNA testing. We just want to make sure everyone has resources available if needed." My stomach dropped. "What kind of unexpected information?" "Oh, sometimes people find out they have siblings they didn't know about, or discover their heritage is different than they thought. It's usually exciting, but occasionally it can be emotionally complex." The way she said emotionally complex made my skin crawl. This was clearly a euphemism for something much worse than discovering you're less Irish than you thought. I kept thinking about all the strange questions, the pitying looks, the careful way everyone was handling me. Kyle noticed my anxiety when we grabbed breakfast the next morning. "You seem really stressed," he said, cutting into his pancakes. "Are you having second thoughts about this? Don't you think everyone's acting weird?" I asked. "Like they know something we don't?" Kyle shrugged. "Reality TV people are always dramatic. They probably just want us to be nervous for better television." But Mom had noticed it too. She pulled me aside while we were waiting to go into makeup and asked if I wanted to back out. "We can still leave," she said quietly. "If this doesn't feel right, we don't have to go through with it." Part of me wanted to take her up on that offer. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong, that we were walking into a trap we didn't understand. But we'd come so far, invested so much time and energy, and honestly, I was terrified of looking paranoid and dramatic in front of the cameras. I'm probably just overthinking it, I told her. Let's see this through. The final warning sign came just before filming began. They had us sitting in those comfortable chairs, cameras rolling, and David started explaining how DNA testing works. He talked about genetic markers, family connections, and the different types of information the tests could reveal. Then he looked directly at me. Sarah, as you know, genetic testing can sometimes reveal information about biological relationships that people weren't previously aware of. How would you handle it if the results showed something unexpected about your family structure? The question hit me like a physical blow. The way he phrased it, the way everyone suddenly got very quiet, the way the cameras seemed to zoom in on my face. I felt like prey being circled by predators, and I finally understood what had been bothering me for the past 3 days. They already knew what the results said. This wasn't a fun family adventure or an educational exploration of our heritage. This was an ambush, carefully orchestrated for maximum dramatic impact. Whatever was in those DNA results was going to hurt me, and they'd known it all along. They'd brought us here, put us on camera, and set us up for a devastating reveal that would be broadcast to millions of strangers. I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, I managed to say. But my voice was shaking and my hands were trembling in my lap. David smiled, that same practiced, sympathetic smile. Well then, let's see what your DNA has to tell us about your family. The moment I realized we were being set up for an ambush, I should have stood up, ripped off my microphone, and walked out of that studio. But there's something about being under those bright lights, surrounded by cameras and producers, that makes you feel trapped in a way that's hard to explain. It's like being a deer in headlights, except the headlights are attached to a machine designed to exploit your pain for entertainment. Actually, I said, interrupting David mid-sentence as he reached for the envelope containing our results. Can we have a minute? I need to talk to my family. The room went silent. David's practiced smile faltered slightly, and I could see Angela in my peripheral vision making urgent hand gestures to someone behind the cameras. But I was past caring about their schedule or their dramatic reveals. Of course, David said, his voice still professionally warm, but with an edge of irritation. Take all the time you need. They killed the lights and the cameras stopped rolling. Suddenly, the cozy family room set felt cold and artificial, like a stage that had been abandoned mid-performance. The spell was broken, and I could finally think clearly for the first time in 3 days. Something's wrong, I whispered to my family, pulling them into a huddle in the corner of the set. They already know what these results say, and based on how everyone's been acting, it's not good. Dad's face was grim. I've had the same feeling. The way they keep asking about your biological father, the loaded questions about family resemblance. They're building towards something. Mom looked stricken. Maybe we should just leave. We don't have to do this. But Kyle was shaking his head. If we leave now, we'll never know. And honestly, how bad could it be? So what if Sarah has some different ancestry than the rest of us? That's not exactly earth-shattering. I wanted to believe him, but the pit in my stomach told a different story. This wasn't about ancestry percentages or discovering we had different cultural backgrounds than expected. The careful way everyone had been treating me, the specific focus on my relationship with Dad, the questions about biological versus chosen family. It all pointed to something much more fundamental and devastating. Angela approached us with that same manufactured concern she'd been showing all weekend. Is everything okay? Are you having second thoughts? We just want to understand what we're walking into, I said. Oh, you clearly already know what these results say. Can you give us some indication of what we're dealing with? Angela's professional mask slipped for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been genuine sympathy. I can't discuss the specific results, but I can tell you that DNA testing sometimes reveals information about family relationships that can be surprising or emotionally challenging to process. What does that mean exactly? Dad asked, his voice sharp with protective anger. It means, Angela said carefully, that sometimes the biological relationships people assume exist in their families are different from what DNA testing reveals. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Different biological relationships. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications hit me. This wasn't about ancestry or heritage. This was about paternity. "Are you saying," I whispered, "that the DNA test shows Dad isn't my biological father?" Angela's silence was answer enough. The world tilted sideways for a moment. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, about the fundamental facts of my existence, suddenly felt uncertain. Dad had been my father for 26 years. He was the man who'd raised me, loved me, been there for every important moment of my life. The idea that we weren't biologically related shouldn't matter, but somehow it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. "But that's impossible," Mom said, her voice barely audible. "I mean, we knew Robert wasn't Sarah's biological father. We've never hidden that. Her biological father left when she was 2. Angela looked uncomfortable, like she was being forced to deliver news she'd rather avoid. "The DNA results show genetic connections that were unexpected based on the family history you provided." Kyle grabbed my arm, his face pale. "What does that mean?" "If Dad isn't Sarah's biological father, and her biological father supposedly left when she was 2, then who is?" The question that hung unspoken in the air was even worse. What if my biological father hadn't left? What if he'd been here all along? I looked around at my family, at these people who were the most important relationships in my life, and suddenly felt like I was looking at strangers. If the DNA results were going to reveal that one of them was Aunt, who I thought they were, then everything I believed about my family was built on lies. "We need to know," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever this is, we need to know the truth." Dad put his arm around me, and for a moment I felt like a little girl again, safe and protected in his embrace. "Are you sure? Once we know, we can't unknow it." I thought about Marcus back in Portland, probably watching Netflix and eating leftover pizza, blissfully unaware that his girlfriend was about to have her entire identity rewritten on national television. I thought about all the Sunday dinners, the camping trips, the bedtime stories and soccer games and graduation ceremonies that had built the foundation of who I was. I thought about the simple, uncomplicated love I'd always felt for my family, and they'd felt for me.
Ow.
But I also knew that ignorance was no longer an option. The truth was sitting in that envelope, and pretending it didn't exist wouldn't make it go away. Whatever was about to be revealed would change everything, but at least we'd be dealing with reality instead of living in a lie. "Let's do this," I said, walking back to the set with my family following behind me. The cameras rolled again, the lights came up, and David resumed his position with that damning envelope in his hands. But now, I wasn't an excited daughter, hoping to discover royal ancestry. I was a woman preparing for her world to end, and somehow that felt like the most honest I'd been all weekend. The envelope in David's hands looked so ordinary, just white paper with our family name written in neat black letters. Such a small, insignificant thing to contain the power to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. "Before we open these results," David said, his voice taking on that serious television tone that meant we were approaching the climax of our episode, "I want to remind everyone that DNA testing can sometimes reveal unexpected information about family relationships. The most important thing to remember is that family is about love and connection, not just genetics." His little disclaimer felt like a doctor warning you that surgery might hurt right before cutting you open without anesthesia. Well-intentioned, but ultimately useless when you're about to be torn apart. I was sitting between Mom and Dad, with Kyle on Dad's other side. My hands were folded in my lap, but I could feel them shaking. Mom reached over and squeezed my knee, trying to offer comfort, but her hand was trembling too. We all knew we were about to step off a cliff together. David opened the envelope with theatrical precision, pulling out several sheets of paper covered in charts, graphs, and genetic information that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all I could understand. He studied them for what felt like an eternity, his expression carefully neutral. "Let's start with some good news," he said, looking up at us with that practiced smile. "The testing confirms that Kyle and Sarah are indeed full biological siblings, sharing both parents." I felt a tiny wave of relief. At least Kyle was still my brother. Whatever else was about to be revealed, that fundamental relationship remained intact. Now, for Sarah's paternal connections, David continued, and I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. "The DNA results show that Robert is not Sarah's biological father, which aligns with what the family already knew. So far, so expected. We'd never hidden the fact that Dad had married Mom when I was young, that my biological father had left. This wasn't news. However, David said, and that one word carried the weight of an executioner's axe. The testing reveals something unexpected about Sarah's biological parentage. He paused for dramatic effect, and I wanted to scream at him to just get it over with. The suspense was torture, worse than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. Sarah's biological father is actually someone the family knows well. The DNA shows a direct paternal match with Kyle and Sarah's maternal grandfather, William. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to process them. Maternal grandfather William. But that would mean ... No. That couldn't be right. That would mean Mom's father was also my father. Which was impossible, because Mom's father was my grandfather. You can't be someone's grandfather and father at the same time, unless... The realization hit me like a freight train. "Are you saying," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of my heart pounding, "that my grandfather is my biological father?" David nodded solemnly. The DNA results indicate that William is both Kyle's grandfather and Sarah's biological father. The studio went completely silent. I could hear the hum of the cameras, the whisper of the air conditioning, someone's watch ticking. But from my family, nothing. Just absolute, devastating silence. I looked at Mom, and her face had gone completely white. Her mouth was slightly open, like she was trying to say something but couldn't form words. Her eyes were wide with horror and what looked like recognition. It's as if pieces of a puzzle she'd been avoiding for 26 years were suddenly clicking into place. "That's impossible," Kyle said, his voice hollow. "Grandpa William died when Sarah was 5. Are you saying that he and Mom ... He couldn't finish the sentence. None of us could say it out loud. The implication was too horrible, too fundamentally wrong to put into words. David, with his professional obligation to dramatic revelation, said it for us. The DNA evidence suggests that Sarah is the result of a sexual relationship between her mother Janet and her maternal grandfather. William, making William both Sarah's grandfather through her mother and her biological father. The words hung in the air like poison gas, contaminating everything they touched. I felt like I was going to vomit or pass out, or both. The room was spinning, and I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. This meant that my mother, my sweet loving mother, who made pot roast every Sunday, and kept photo albums of every school play, had been sexually abused by her own father. It meant that I was unjust the result of an affair, or a one-night stand with some stranger who'd abandoned us. I was the product of incest, of a violation so fundamental and wrong that my mind could barely comprehend it. I looked at Dad, the man who raised me and loved me and never once made me feel like anything other than his daughter, and saw tears streaming down his face. Not tears of rejection or betrayal, but tears of fury and heartbreak for what this meant about Mom's past, about my origins, about the violence that had created me. "Janet," David said gently, "were you aware of this biological relationship?" Mom was shaking her head back and forth, over and over, like she could make the truth disappear through sheer denial. "My father never. He wouldn't have. This has to be a mistake." But even as she said it, I could see in her eyes that she knew it wasn't a mistake. Maybe she'd suppressed the memories. Maybe she'd convinced herself it had been something else. Maybe she'd buried the truth so deep that she almost believed her own story about a boyfriend who left. But the DNA doesn't lie. And somewhere in the deepest parts of her mind, she'd always known. I was 28 years old. I'd just discovered that my entire existence was rooted in the worst kind of violence imaginable. Every breath I'd ever taken, every moment of joy I'd ever experienced, every accomplishment I'd ever achieved, all of it was built on a foundation of abuse and trauma that had been hidden from me for my entire life. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of our destruction for the entertainment of strangers, who would watch our pain unfold from the safety of their living rooms. The moments immediately after the revelation were a blur of shock and chaos that still feels surreal when I think about it. One second we were a normal family sitting under studio lights, and the next we were strangers staring at each other across an unbridgeable chasm of horror and disbelief. Mom relaxed. Not dramatically, not like in movies where people faint gracefully into someone's arms. She just sort of crumpled in on herself, her face buried in her hands, making these awful keening sounds that I'd never heard from her before. Sounds like a wounded animal, raw and primal and heartbreaking. Kyle jumped up so fast his chair fell over backward. "Turn off the cameras," he shouted at the production crew. "Turn them off right now." Oh, but they didn't. David was asking follow-up questions. Angela was gesturing frantically to keep filming, and the cameras kept rolling while my family disintegrated in real time. It was exactly what they'd wanted. It's exactly what they'd de-orchestrated by bringing us here and ambushing us with information that should have been delivered privately. With counselors and support systems in place, Dad was holding Mom while she sobbed, but he was looking at me with this expression of fierce protectiveness mixed with helpless rage. I could see him trying to figure out how to shield me from this, how to make it better, but there was no fixing this. There was no going back to the innocence we'd had an hour ago. "We're leaving," Dad said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Right now. We're done." I stood up on shaking legs, but the room was spinning, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath. The magnitude of what I'd just learned was hitting me in waves. Not only was I the product of incest, but my mother had been a victim of sexual abuse by her own father, probably as a child. The man I'd called Grandpa William, who had died when I was 5, who I had vague memories of as a kind old man who gave me candy and read me stories, had been a monster. "Wait," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Mom, I need to understand. When did it happen? How long did it go on?" Mom looked up at me with tear-streaked face, and I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Shame so deep, it was like looking into a bottomless well. "I don't remember," she whispered. "I've tried so hard not to remember." "But you knew," I said, and it wasn't really a question. "When you told us about my biological father leaving, you knew that wasn't true." She nodded, barely perceptibly. "I couldn't tell you the truth. How could I tell you that? How could I tell anyone that?" Kyle was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "Jesus Christ, Mom. All these years, all the family gatherings, all the times we talked about Grandpa like he was some beloved family patriarch. He was a rapist. He raped his own daughter, and you just let us all go on believing he was a good man." "He was my father," Mom said, her voice breaking. "He was sick, but he was still my father, and Sarah was innocent. She didn't deserve to know where she came from. She deserved to have a normal childhood, a normal family. So you lied to everyone," Kyle continued, his anger building. "You lied to Dad when you married him. You lied to us kids our entire lives. You let some stranger take the blame for abandoning Sarah when the truth was so much worse." "Stop," Dad said sharply. "Just stop. Your mother was a victim. She was probably a child when this happened. She was protecting Sarah the only way she knew how. But I wasn't feeling protected. I was feeling like my entire identity had been built on a lie. Like every story I'd been told about myself was fiction designed to hide something unspeakable. The casual way Mom had always deflected questions about my biological father suddenly made perfect sense.
Ow.
But it also made me feel like I'd been living in a carefully constructed fantasy. "Were there other times?" I asked, the question scraping my throat raw. "Was it just once, or did it happen regularly?" Mom's silence was answer enough. The way her shoulders shook, the way she couldn't meet my eyes, told me that the abuse had been ongoing, systematic, probably lasting years. My sweet, loving mother had survived horrors I couldn't even imagine. And then she had to live with the daily reminder of that trauma every time she looked at me. "Going to be sick," I said, and I meant it literally. The room was spinning faster now, and waves of nausea were washing over me. I ran toward what I hoped was a bathroom, barely making it before I threw up everything in my stomach. When I came back out, the cameras were finally off, and the production crew was giving us some space. My family was huddled together in the corner of the set, talking in hushed, urgent voices. They looked up when they saw me, and I realized that everything between us had changed forever. I wasn't just Sarah anymore. I was the living evidence of the worst thing that had ever happened to our family. Every time Mom looked at me, she would be reminded of her father's abuse. Every time Kyle looked at me, he would remember that his beloved grandfather had been a predator. Every time Dad looked at me, he would think about the violence that had created the daughter he loved. "I need to go home," I said. "I need to call Marcus. I need to get out of here." We left Los Angeles that night, flying back to Portland in complete silence. The show had gotten what they wanted, a dramatic, devastating reveal that would make for compelling television. They'd ambushed a family with information, that should have been handled with extreme care and sensitivity, and they'd captured every moment of our destruction on camera. But they'd also torn apart the only family I'd ever known, and I wasn't sure if we would ever be able to put the pieces back together. The flight back to Portland felt like traveling through purgatory. We sat in our assigned seats, staring straight ahead, each of us trapped in our own private hell of processing what we'd learned. I kept catching glimpses of other passengers looking at us with curiosity, probably wondering why our whole family looked like we were returning from a funeral. In a way, we were. The family we'd been that morning was gone forever. Marcus was waiting for me at the airport, his face creased with worry. I'd called him from LAX and tried to explain what had happened, but how do you summarize something like this in a phone call? The DNA test revealed that my grandfather was my biological father. Sounds like the setup to a bad joke until you realize it's your actual life. He held me while I cried in the parking garage, not asking questions, just letting me fall apart in his arms. That night, lying in our bed in our normal apartment, in our normal life, I tried to reconcile the person I'd been that morning with the person I was now. Same body, same memories, same relationships, but somehow fundamentally different because the story of my origins had been rewritten in the cruelest possible way. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in how trauma ripples through families. Mom started seeing a therapist who specialized in childhood sexual abuse, finally beginning to unpack decades of suppressed memories and shame. The sessions were brutal, and there were days when she could barely function. But slowly she began to remember and acknowledge what had happened to her as a child. Dad struggled with guilt, convinced he should have somehow known or protected Mom better, even though the abuse had happened years before they met. Kyle was angry at everyone and everything, furious at the lies, furious at the show, furious at a dead man he could no longer confront. And I was just trying to figure out who I was in light of this new information. The show aired 3 months later, and it was every bit as exploitative as I'd feared. They'd edited our devastation into a tidy hour-long narrative with dramatic music and reaction shots, turning our genuine trauma into entertainment. The online comments were a mix of sympathy and judgment, with strangers debating our family's choices and speculating about details of our private pain. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath. Other people started reaching out, sharing their own stories of family secrets revealed through DNA testing. I heard from dozens of people who'd discovered affairs, hidden adoptions, unknown siblings, and yes, even other cases of incest that had been buried for generations. There was a whole community of people whose identities had been rewritten by genetic testing, and many of them had found ways to build meaningful lives despite the shocking truths they'd uncovered. One message in particular stayed with me. It was from a woman named Diana who discovered at age 35 that her beloved father was actually her grandfather, the result of her grandfather sexually abusing her mother when she was 14. "I know it feels like everything you believed about yourself is a lie," she wrote, "but you're still the same person you were before you knew. The love your family has for you isn't diminished by the circumstances of your conception. You're not responsible for the violence that created you, but you get to decide what to do with the life that resulted from it." That perspective shift was crucial for my healing. I started seeing my own therapist, working through the complex feelings of shame, anger, and grief that came with learning about my origins. Slowly, I began to separate my identity from the circumstances of my conception. I wasn't defined by being the product of incest, any more than I would have been defined by being the product of a loving relationship. I was defined by the choices I made, the relationships I built, the love I gave and received. My relationship with Mom deepened in unexpected ways. She worked through her own healing. We were able to talk honestly about her experience and how it had shaped our family. She apologized for the lies, but I came to understand that she'd done the best she could with an impossible situation. She'd protected me from a truth that would have devastated me as a child, and she'd built me a loving family despite the trauma in her past. Dad and I grew closer too. If anything, learning that we weren't biologically related made me appreciate even more what an incredible father he'd been. He'd chosen to love me, chosen to raise me, chosen to be my dad in every way that mattered. Biology is just genetic material, but parenthood is about showing up, day after day, with love and support and guidance. Kyle took longer to process everything, but eventually we found our way back to each other. Our relationship was different now, complicated by the knowledge of where I came from, but it was still real and valuable. We were still siblings, still bound by 2 decades of shared experiences and genuine affection. The show tried to get us back for a follow-up episode, promising counseling resources and a chance to heal on camera. We declined. Our healing wasn't entertainment, and we'd learned the hard way that reality television cares more about drama than the real human beings whose lives they exploit. Marcus and I got engaged 6 months after the revelation. When he proposed, he made a point of saying that he was choosing me, all of me, including the complicated history I'd inherited. "Your story doesn't define you," he said, "but it's part of what made you the strong, compassionate person I fell in love with." We're planning a small wedding, just family and close friends, people who love us for who we are, rather than the dramatic circumstances that brought us together. I still have hard days. Sometimes I catch myself looking in the mirror and wondering what traits I inherited from a man who was capable of such violence. I worry about having children, about passing on genetic material that carries such darkness. But my therapist reminds me that I'm not my grandfather any more than Mom was defined by being his victim. We all have the capacity for both good and evil, and our choices are what matter. The most surprising outcome has been my relationship with advocacy work. I started volunteering with organizations that support survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And eventually, I began speaking at conferences about the unique trauma of discovering family secrets through DNA testing. There's something powerful about transforming your pain into purpose, about using your worst experiences to help others navigate similar challenges. Mom and I have become closer than we ever were before the truth came out. Our relationship is more honest now, built on reality rather than carefully maintained fiction. She's an incredible survivor, and watching her reclaim her story and find peace with her past has been inspiring. She still makes pot roast every Sunday, and we still have family dinners. But now we talk about real things instead of skating over the surface of our lives. Last month, I got a letter from another woman whose family had been on a DNA testing show. Her situation was different, but equally devastating. She'd discovered that the man she thought was her brother was actually her father, the result of her grandfather abusing her mother. She thanked me for speaking publicly about my experience and said it had helped her feel less alone in her pain. That's when I knew the decision to share our story, despite the exploitation we'd endured, had been worth it. Not for the entertainment value or the dramatic reveals, but because hidden trauma thrives in secrecy and shame. When we speak truth about the darkness in our families, we create space for other people to do the same. I'm 30 now, married to Marcus, working as a victim advocate. Living a life that's nothing like what I'd planned, but everything I needed it to be. I still think about that eager young woman who applied for a reality TV show hoping to discover she was descended from royalty, and I feel protective of her innocence. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she survived it and built something meaningful from the wreckage. The show still airs occasionally in reruns, and sometimes strangers recognize me and want to talk about our episode. Most are kind, but some ask intrusive questions or make comments about how crazy our story was. I've learned to set boundaries, to protect my peace, while still being open about my experience when it might help someone else. DNA testing has become incredibly popular, with millions of people discovering family secrets that challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves. While the technology is remarkable and can provide valuable medical information and genealogical insights, I always warn people to be prepared for unexpected revelations. Sometimes the truth sets you free, but sometimes it tears apart everything you thought you knew about your life. If I could go back and choose differently, would I still take that DNA test? That's the question I get asked most often, and it's one I've struggled with for years. The knowledge of my origins has brought immense pain, but it's also brought healing to our family in ways we never could have imagined. Mom was able to finally address her trauma. Dad was able to understand the full scope of what he'd taken on when he married her, and I was able to stop living in a fiction that protected me, but also limited my ability to fully understand myself and my family. The truth is messy and complicated, and sometimes devastating, but it's also real. And after living through the worst possible revelation about my family, I've learned that reality, no matter how painful, it's always preferable to living in a lie. We're stronger now, more honest, more connected to each other in authentic ways that weren't possible when we were all pretending that everything was simple and uncomplicated. Now, when I look at my husband and think about the family we might build together, I see only possibilities rooted in truth and choice rather than secrets and shame. I know that love is stronger than genetics, that family is about commitment rather than biology, that even the darkest origins can't diminish the light you choose to create in your own life. The DNA test didn't destroy my family after all. It just revealed that the family we'd built through love and choice was more powerful than the one we'd inherited through blood.